Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Chapter 8 is reasonably repetitious. It's going to say the same thing in a different manner a couple of times on some things. And it's doing that to drive home a point. But frankly, it's one of the most interesting chapters as I've found in the book. And it's also one that often confuses because of its imagery. It has the imagery of a ram with 2 horns, a male goat with 1 horn that then becomes 4 horns, and then a little horn that grows and grows, and all of this coming just on the heels of the 10 horns and little horn of chapter 7 that we just came through. So it can be a little confusing, but we'll try to work our way through all that. Much of it in chapter 8 is about a type and foreshadows, or the types and foreshadows that are the Hanukkah events that happened during the intertestamental period. Most of what this is talking about you can apply to the events that built up to Hanukkah, which was the rededication of the temple. It's about events that was leading to the Hanukkah celebration. Chapter 8 of Daniel prophetically deals with that tragedy. Also here, though not named, we are introduced to a person of really great importance to us in both a historical and a prophetic sense. And the prophetic, he is a type and foreshadow of the false Messiah. He came on the scene some 2,500 years ago with characteristics and attitude very close to, if not identical, to the coming false Messiah. Probably why the little horn analogy is used for both this type and foreshadow, who is Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, and for the false Messiah. Little horn analogy used for both. So let's start this then by going to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5, which says, "Also you have forgotten the counsel which speaks with you as sons." And it says, "My son, don't despise the discipline of Adonai or become despondent when he corrects you." I'm giving you this so that you will understand that this means that the stuff that's going on at the particular time in history in Daniel chapter 8 has to do with Adonai bringing correction. Adonai bringing correction in most types. In fact, what has been happening to the Jewish people since the start of the times of the Gentiles, way back in the early 1600s BC, is correction being brought to his people. In Daniel 8, God is simply bringing discipline, his discipline, to those he loves. A tough love to bring correction to his people. So keep this in mind in Hebrews 12:5, because we're going to enlarge on it in just a few minutes. Now from here, Daniel chapter 8, until the end of Daniel, the original language is again Hebrew. We've gone back to Hebrew because the message deals only with Israel. See, remember from Daniel 2:4 through Daniel 7, the original language was Aramaic, The message in that part of Daniel was also for Gentile consumption, and Aramaic was the international language of the Gentiles at that particular time. Now, from this point on, the text is primarily occupied with human history as it relates to Israel. Certainly important to the Gentiles, but primarily focused on histories relating to Israel. There are 3 more Gentile kingdoms that will occupy the world from where we're picking this up in Daniel. Daniel from here on focuses on what will happen to Israel during the expanse of time that these 3 other kingdoms of the Gentiles cover. God reveals to Daniel the answer to the question of what happens to Israel in this time frame, all the way from chapters 8 through chapters 12 of Daniel. So let's begin this with Daniel 8, 1 and 2. After the first vision, it was in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar that another vision appeared to me, Daniel. I looked into the vision, and as I looked, I found myself in Shushan, the capital, in the province of Elam. I looked into the vision, and I was by the Uli Canal. This is really the second revelation that's given directly to Daniel from God. We looked at the first one last week. This would be about 550 BC. Babylon still had 12 years of rule as the dominant Gentile empire, and Belshazzar, the king at that time, had another 12 hours to live. So that would place this between the 4th and 5th chapters of Daniel that we've already studied. Daniel reports that in this vision he's transported to Shushan. This city is located about 230 miles east of Babylon. It's about 120 miles north of the Persian Gulf. That would make it located in what is today southwestern Iran, modern-day Iran. It's near the modern village of Shush, and of interest is that the Shia Muslims claim that the Tomb of Daniel is at or near this village, and the site is the object of very devout veneration on the part of Shia Muslims. They think this is where the world should all come and poke around. There's a probability that Daniel didn't control this area or this city even at the time of Daniel's vision, which may in part account for Daniel's astonishment. This Shushan is destined to become the capital of the Persian Empire, rather than Babylon becoming its capital. This future capital of Persia had been probably unknown by anyone at the time of the vision as far as it becoming a capital. So it appears that Daniel was also transported ahead of time in this vision, and that fact alone makes this vision prophetic. And then Daniel, of course, will deal with even more future events beyond this being taken to Shushan. Daniel finds it necessary to define the particular location of the city and of the vision in detail. Actually, the city is located between the Kopes and the Karparat rivers. They're right near where they would junction and come together into a single river. And a large canal was dug about 900 feet up, like right across here, to connect these 2 rivers on a third side of the city, which would be then located within this moat that's created by the canal and those 2 rivers. Daniel finds himself projected in this vision to a place that will become the home of Esther, that it's the city from which Nehemiah will come to Jerusalem later on. And in 1884, ancient Shushan was discovered, excavated, and many archaeological treasures found. In fact, the Code of Hammurabi was found during that excavation there, about 1901. The Code of Hammurabi dates back to a time even earlier than the Babylonian Empire that was Daniel's Neo-Babylon. It deals back to the original Babylon about 1700 BC. Over information, right? Daniel 8, 3 and 4. I looked up, and as I watched there in front of the stream stood a ram with 2 horns. The horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up later than the other. I saw the ram pushing to the west, the north, and the south, and no animals could stand against it, nor was there anyone that could rescue from its power, so it did as it pleased, and it became very strong. Vision obviously is of a ram, a male sheep. The ram has 2 horns, is standing alongside of Shushan, along the canal. The 2 horns are unequal, one higher than the other. That is talking about the fact that the Persians grew up to dominate the empire. That would be the longer horn. And one grew in before the other one, and that indicating that the Medes had preceded the Persians. Perfect description in these horns, really, of the Medo-Persian Empire. In earlier visions, Medo-Persia was really the chest and arms of silver that we're talking about in the vision that was in Daniel chapter 2. It's represented by the bear in chapter 7, and here in chapter 8 it's represented by a ram. This all of them representing Medo-Persia. Now, the thing about this is what Daniel is being shown is prophetic of the next coming Gentile empire, the number 2 Gentile empire, Medo-Persia. He's being shown this while he's still in the first empire. Ram pushes west and north, south, but not to the east. No other beast could stand before it, and neither could man or beast rescue anybody from its power. As Daniel puts it, the ram did according to its own will. It did as it pleased. It was the empire. The directions here speak to where the Medo-Persian Empire really expanded. It's in the actual history that expansion was what came about. They did expand slightly to the east, but the main thrust was in the other directions. Why is Medo-Persia represented by the ram? Well, a number of scholars believe it is because Badan-ish, the guardian spirit of Medo-Persian Empire, was portrayed in the form of a ram that had sharp-pointed horns. Also know that when the Persian king stood at the head of his army, he wore the head of a ram on his head. That must have been a real sight to see. He probably looked like a caricature of his idol that he worshipped. Daniel 8, 5 and 7. I was beginning to understand when a male goat came from the west, passing over the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a prominent horn between its eyes. It approached the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the river, and charged it with savage force. I watched as it advanced on the ram, filled with rage against it, and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. It threw the ram to the ground and trampled it down. And there was no one that could rescue it from the goat's power. Daniel has been given a prophecy. He was first given the prophecy about the coming second empire. Now he's being given a prophecy of the third empire of man that's coming. And that compares on our chart to, in the statue of chapter 2, the belly and thighs of bronze. The leopard of chapter 7 has now become a goat in chapter 8. But they're all talking about the Greek Empire that's coming. It's coming from the west. It's generally understood to be the oncoming Greek Empire, this goat. It's the oncoming Greek Empire's army. Specifically, the single horn stood for the king of the that Greek army, Alexander the Great, coming from the west to attack the Medo-Persian Empire. Again, the speed at which Greece conquered the ancient world is represented by the goat never touching the ground. It was like one great giant leap that brought it in. Single horn is unusual. It represents the king of this empire. It is located between the two eyes. Now, eyes, when used in Scripture symbolically, usually represent human intelligence. And Alexander the Great possessed unique intelligence. At age 22, he led the Greek army that had attacked Medo-Persia here, and in fact amazed the ancient world with his military genius. His personal resources, resourcefulness in devising military tactics enabled him to crush the full might of the Medo-Persian Empire in just 3 years. 3 years. He started his campaign in 334. It was over with in 331. Now, we think that the reason for the fury assigned to this male goat and his charge with the savage force is assigned historically to Greece having been attacked by Medo-Persia earlier in history. So revenge was the great motivator of Greece. They were getting even with Medo-Persia for the attack against them earlier. When the two horns are broken off the ram, it refers to the disintegration of the Medo-Persian Empire. The ram, having no power to stand against the goat, is cast to the ground and is trampled on. Daniel 8:8, please. The male goat then became extremely strong. But when it was strong, the big horn was broken, and in its place arose what appeared to be 4 horns in the directions of the 4 winds of heaven. An unexpected development occurs. The great horn is between the two eyes is broken off just when it's at its pinnacle of success. Both liberal and conservative scholars assign this to the untimely death of Alexander the Great, who died at the age of 32. His death left no really effective leader over the great landmass he had conquered, and it really took 20 years for his empire to be successfully divided among the 4 that took over. The 4 horns that emerged are symbolic of the divisions of the empire, and Alexander's 4 generals divided it among themselves eventually. Ptolemy took Egypt, Cyrene, Cyrus, Israel, and several cities on the coast of Asia Minor. Seleucus took Syria, Babylon, Southeast Asia Minor, and the Iranian Plateau. Lysimachus took Thrace and Western Asia Minor, and Cassandra took Macedonia and ancient Greece proper. Daniel 8, 9, and 10. Out of one of them, one of these 4 horns, came a little horn which grew extremely big in the directions of the south and east, and it grew in the direction of the glory. Take note of the word the glory there. It grew so great that it reached the army of heaven. It hurled some of the army and the stars to the ground and trampled them. Daniel's watching the vision. And a 5th horn, a little horn, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, came up out of one of the goat's horns, the one of the Syrian division. And remember, we're doing things with horns here. The order of the horns were 1 great horn that's broken off. It's replaced by 4 horns. And now comes a 5th horn out of one of these 4 horns that replaced the original one. Little at first, but then it grew to be big, to be great, to have influence towards the south and the east, and the direction of the glory. Now, the direction of the glory here is symbolic. Take note of that. The glory here is symbolic. Other translations have this as the beautiful land, not as the glory. Stern uses that term. The word land, however, isn't in the original Hebrew text. We'll see later that the glory refers to Israel and particularly to Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem is where the glory of God resided in the temple, which became Antiochus's target. So he attacked the glory. What this means is that a king of significance would come to power from one of the four kingdoms. What Daniel is saying means that a king of significance would come to power out of one of the four kingdoms or divisions of the Greek Empire as it was split up following Alexander's death. The glory, Jerusalem and the temple, is located between the area of Syria and Egypt, which the two of the generals divided among themselves. The conquest here in our passage conforms to the history of Syria as we understand it, particularly under Antiochus IV, generally known as Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the 8th king of the Seleucid dynasty. This can be found in the book of 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 10 and on, and then 6:16. 1 Maccabees is really a collection of epistles, called the Apocrypha. A lot of Bibles will have them. It's also published as a separate book. Antiochus IV had an unauspicious beginning. He was not the rightful heir to the throne, and he had to resort to bribery, deceit to become king. But once king, he had a significant impact. Now understand, he's being a type and foreshadow for us of the coming false Messiah. So understand that what he does, we can project to the false Messiah. Antiochus Epiphanes had to resort to bribery and deceit to become powerful, to become who he became. Once king, he attacked the south, Egypt. Again, we find this in 1 Maccabees 1. He attacked east, Armenia and Elymas. 1 Maccabees chapter 3 and chapter 6 gives us this. His aim was to enforce Greek religions and Greek civil policies on those that he conquered. That's important to understand what he was going to do. His aim was to enforce Greek religion and Greek civil policies on those that he conquered. In other words, to Hellenize those who came under his control and his rule. And he came to do this to Israel and to the Jews. This was part of what he wanted to do. Now, look at that verse 10 again. This is symbolic. It's talking about the little horn here. It grew so great that it reached the army of heaven. It hurled some of the army and the stars to the ground and trampled them. This is symbolic. This little horn grew so great that it hurled some of the army and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. The Jews, particularly those Jews that are faithful and observant, trust God, are sometimes symbolized by stars. We see that in Genesis, where Abraham and Jacob and Isaac were all promised descendants that would number as many as the stars. In Daniel 12:3 that's coming up here, we're going to see those that turn many to righteousness will shine like stars forever. We're dealing with only Israel in this passage. And again in Revelation 12:1, that tells us that there are 12 stars in a crown representing the 12 tribes of Israel. So the passage that we're looking at here then symbolizes that the little horn will persecute and kill Jews. Antiochus commanded that Jews submit to pagan worship of the idols that he provided in place of Adonai. He ordered them to forget Torah. He ordered them to profane the Sabbath and the feast days. He ordered them to stop circumcising their sons. He offered pigs and other unclean animals as sacrifices on the altar before the temple. He ordered Jews to defile themselves with all kinds of perverted practices. You see, in his mind, he was changing them for their betterment. He was their Messiah. But in fact, he was a false Messiah in doing this. Torah scrolls were torn and burned. Jews who kept copies of the Torah or had their sons circumcised were put to death. In fact, if they found a Jewish child that had been circumcised, they hung him. Many righteous Jews at this point chose death rather than to comply. And that's found in 1 Maccabees, again, chapter 1, beginning in verse 29. Now, in addition to this, we have to look ahead with this prophecy to the time of the coming false Messiah that Antiochus Epiphanes types and foreshadows, who will, at this time, actually reach into the heavens with his blasphemy and touches the actual army of heaven, the angels of heaven, with his blasphemies. Not physically, but with the oration that he's putting out. See, he's controlling the whole world now, not just a little chunk of the Third Empire of Man. He's controlling the whole world. And so he's having a reaction of the heavenly host to what he is doing in his war with God, I guess is the best way to put it. We always have to keep in mind that things that are going on earth have a spiritual war behind them going on in heaven very often. Daniel 8:11 through 14. Yes, it even considered itself as great as the prince of the army. We're back to Antiochus Epiphanes. The prince of the army would be God himself. Antiochus considered himself as great as God himself. The regular burnt offering was taken away from him, God, the prince of the army, and the place of his sanctuary, God's sanctuary, was thrown down. Through sin, the army was put in its power. Through sin, the army was put in its power along with the regular burnt offering. It flung truth on the ground as it acted and prospered. Next. Then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to the speaker, these are two angels talking to each other that Daniel's overhearing, how long will the events of the vision last? That's these things that we've just been talking about. How long will the events of the vision last? This vision concerning the regular offering and the transgression which is so appalling, which allows the sanctuary and the army to be trampled underfoot. The army, I think, here representing Israel itself as being the physical army of God on the earth. And the first one said to me, to Daniel, 2,300 evenings and mornings, after which the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. Wow. Notice how this behavior that's being talked about here is dealing with something that is very much like what's going to be dealt with when we come against the false Messiah. He's going to be attacking God. He's going to take over Jerusalem. He's going to take over the temple. He's going to want to be worshipped there. Remember what Daniel has done in dealing with the fourth empire of man in chapter 7. In chapter 7, he's given us a picture of the false Messiah in the little horn. Here in chapter 8, he's giving us a prophecy of another little horn coming in the third empire of man that will act as a type and foreshadow to help us identify this false Messiah that will be coming at the end, the other little horn. See why it can get kind of confusing here as we're working our way through it? Even Yeshua speaks to something that Antiochus Epiphanes did that will be repeated. And that's the setting up of an abomination in the temple that causes desolation. Antiochus Epiphanes directed blasphemies at God himself, just as the little horn of chapter 7 did, and he'll magnify himself against God as he reaches for the honor and glory that belong to God. The temple was so desecrated by Antiochus that it was not fit for use. In fact, when Jews regained control of the temple, they tore the old altar down and built a new one, completely from the ground up. They redid the interior of the temple sanctuary because it was so desecrated that it had to be done. Again, and take note of this, there are obvious parallels between Antiochus Epiphanes and what is prophesied by Daniel 9:27, when we're going to look at that in a couple of weeks. There's an obvious parallel between the coming false Messiah. Think about this. There's an obvious parallel between the coming false Messiah who appears just before the second coming of Messiah and Antiochus Epiphanes who appeared just before the first coming of Messiah. Pattern. At the time of Antiochus, Israel was under huge pressure from the Syrian Greeks to Hellenize, so much so that large numbers of them were doing this just for the sake of peace and safety, just to try and stay out of trouble. When we study this, we see political upheaval and a divided country. Political upheaval in a divided country. What's beginning to go on in Israel today? Political upheaval and a divided country. With a secular group that's going for peace at any cost, and a religious group that's trying to hang on to God in their own way. And it reaches a point in this back and forth where God just turns him over to Antiochus. Here, if this is what you want to do, enjoy it. And takes his hand away. I think that's coming again. I think that's ultimately coming again. That's why things get so out of hand that Israel ultimately has to turn to God completely. Verse 12 here tells us that the people of Israel were actually under Antiochus' power, apparently with divine permission. The daily sacrifices were also under his power. So he was able to substitute heathen worship in place of what God wanted. This all happened because of rebellion by reason of transgression of the Torah by Israel. And this should be understood that the daily sacrifices were given into Antiochus' power in order to permit Antiochus to lead this rebellion and transgression, resulting in the truth being cast to the ground completely. Completely. It's like God is no longer in the picture of Israel as this is all coming to a head. This, I believe, is actually going to happen again in my estimation. The sum total of this verse is that the people of Israel, along with their worship, are given over to the power of Antiochus Epiphanes, a false Messiah. Verse 13, a conversation between two holy ones, angels, is recorded by Daniel. We just looked at that. First, the question, how long will this desecration and the people being trodden underfoot last? Remember, this is a vision, and God's emissaries are discussing the future in this vision in front of Daniel. They're discussing the vision right there in front of Daniel. Verse 14 gives us the answer. 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful states. I want us to notice that this is another type and foreshadow of something that is going to repeat. 2,300 days is less than 6.5 years. 7 years is coming. Types and foreshadows don't have to be exact, they just have to point towards something. Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple and persecuted the Jews from 171 until 165, of span of between 6 and 7 years. A type and foreshadow of a time that's coming when everything's going to be really messed up because of the false Messiah. Now, here are some interesting applicable facts. The temple after restoration was first used again on what would have been December 25th of 165 BC. Now remember, the Gregorian calendar that we have in use today had not yet been invented. It was only invented about 500 years ago, came into use. This is backdating laid out here to give us some perspective to deal with what's going on here. The date that they desecrated the temple was exactly 2 years earlier than this, on December 25th of 167 BC. Temple was restored on December 25th, 165. It had been desecrated 2 years earlier, December 25th, 167. What was going on during those 2 years? The events leading up to Hanukkah. Hanukkah meaning rededication in so many words. Hanukkah meaning rededication of the temple. That's what Hanukkah is all about, a celebration of the rededication of the temple after it was desecrated by the type and foreshadow of the coming false Messiah. Rededication is important. It's a thing that we have to understand, that it's laid out there, and Yeshua comes along and does something very prophetic for us to see and understand about himself. Yeshua came to the temple for the feast of dedication for Hanukkah in John chapter 10, verse 22. Grasp what is important in this. Rededication of the temple was so important, that important, and Yeshua showing up at the temple on Hanukkah, type and foreshadowed that he is going to come to a renewed temple at its dedication as he returns in our future. That sort of blew me away. Maybe the events of Hanukkah might be a more important focus for us to pay attention to on December 25th from now on. Now, what else is there that's so interesting is that all of this began 2,300 days earlier. Now, 2,300 days earlier, and people take this literally, and we should. 2,300 days earlier brings us to September 6th in 171 BC, and that is of real importance because the lawful high priest, his name was Onias III, was murdered in 171 BC, and in that year, fake priests were substituted. And the coming false Messiah will declare himself both king and high priest, and he will be a fake high priest. So from that time on, there were no high priests in the sanctuary of Adonai that were true high priests of Adonai. Only those that were faking it and working for the things of the false Messiah, Antiochus Epiphanes. We can see where God might just be a little aggravated at his people about this time, and why he might have just turned them over to what they were doing and let them have free reign. Now, there's a lot of controversy about these 2,300 days, but most scholars agree that 2,300 days works out historically for us. Daniel chapter 8, verse 15. After I, Daniel, had seen the vision, was trying to understand it, suddenly there stood in front of me someone who appeared to be a man. I heard a human voice calling from between the banks of the Ulai, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. And he came up to where I was standing, and His approach so terrified me that I fell on my face, but he said to me, "Human being, understand that the vision refers to the time of the end." Whoa! All of a sudden here we got a direct statement that this not only is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, this is also talking about the time of the end. Next. As he was speaking to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face towards the ground, but he touched me, set me on my feet, and said, "I'm going to explain to you what will happen at the end of the period of fury, because the vision has to do with the time of the end." Says it again. Says it again. Note in both verses 17 and 19, the time of the end is brought into the equation, and we'll be getting into that. Verse 15 tells us Daniel sought the meaning of this vision, and in response to his seeking, a personage stood before him that was described as one who looked like a man, an angel having the appearance of a man. Then a human voice came from the vicinity of the canal, telling this angel, whose name was Gabriel, to instruct Daniel as to the meaning of the vision. It's interesting to note this is the first time in Scripture that an angel is identified by name. First time in Scripture. Gabriel evidently had the responsibility of delivering important messages to human beings. In Luke chapter 1, he comes to Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, and says, "You're going to have this son." He appeared to him before the incense altar, if you remember. He also appeared to Miriam to announce to her selection to be the mother of Yeshua. He was a pretty important guy. We're going to see Gabriel again in Daniel 9 coming up, depending on what we do next week. The only other angel in Scripture that's mentioned by name is Michael. And we'll see him in Daniel 10 and in Daniel 12. He's also going to be mentioned in Jude, verse 9, and also when we get to Revelation and break that down in Revelation 12:7. The voice from the canal in the presence of Gabriel takes its toll on Daniel, and he has this panic attack. Well, he's earned it. I think that if I'd been there, I'd have a panic attack under the same circumstances. Falls flat on his face. Though Daniel been aware, been awake, he is now in a deep sleep with his face to the ground. He's passed out. If we want to see a similar incident, we can look in Ezekiel chapter 1, beginning in verse 28, and read through into early Ezekiel chapter 2. Gabriel wakes Daniel up, touches him, and stands him upright. And in verse 17, he speaks to the time of the end. And then in 19, he makes it clear he is to let Daniel know that what shall be at the time of the end will be a period of fury. Look at that. I'm going to explain to you what will happen at the end of the period of fury, because the vision has to do with the time of the end. Whose fury? Adonai's fury. Now the term period of fury in the context here and again in Daniel 11:36 refers to the fact that God's indignation created by a rebellious Israel just boils over. God's had all he can take, and it's kazam, a period of fury. As Antiochus is loosed, or was loosed, so will the false Messiah be loosed when we reach that same kind of a point. So how is this to be understood? Well, four major views have emerged among scholars, and they're talking essentially about what we've been looking at. View one is a historical view that all of Daniel 8 has been fulfilled. In Antiochus, there's nothing left to be fulfilled in the future. View two is just the opposite side of the coin, that all of Daniel 8 is future. View three is a dual view, that Daniel 8 is a prophecy of Antiochus, which has been fulfilled, yet there's prophetic of the end of the age when a final world ruler will come who will persecute Israel before the return of Messiah. And then there's view 4, which expands on view 3. This passage is a prophecy historically fulfilled in Antiochus, but also is prophetic of events and a person of the end of the age. And I buy into number 4. I buy into number 4. I think that we'll see when we study Antiochus Epiphanes and we describe him, all of this will become much plainer. It's important that we understand this, though. When we describe him, we're going to look at his character, his personality, what he did, how he did it. We're going to learn a lot about the coming of the false Messiah as we study Antiochus Epiphanes. The beast in chapter 13 of the book of Messiah is this false Messiah that we're going to be learning about as we study Antiochus. Get back to that term fury for a minute. Fury, sometimes translated wrath, sometimes indignation. I like the term indignation, frankly. A study of what that term indignation means, found throughout Scripture, reveals that there are periods of time, actually large periods of time, where God becomes indignant or angry with Israel because of Israel's rebellion against him. And it's during these times that God disciplines Israel in various ways. That's why we really started with that passage from Hebrews 12:5, if you remember that. It helps set us up for thinking for this. God disciplines those he loves. So he disciplines Israel. And when he disciplines Israel, it's usually done at the hands of Gentiles. The term, times of Gentiles, which Yeshua used in Luke 21, and the times of Adonai, the disciplining of Israel, are not the same, although they very often parallel each other in history. Many believe that the indignation/disciplining period began when the Assyrians came down and conquered the northern tribes of Israel and took them off into exile, leaving only Judah and Benjamin. This actually continued, though, until Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, carried off Judah and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Jews were taken into captivity about 538. Many scholars believe that this indignation that caused this began as far back as 734 and will continue until the end of the tribulation period, ending with the second coming of Messiah, because Israel continues to just kind of slap God in the face every time they get a chance, causing a little indignation, or a lot of indignation, depending. Think about it. Think about it. Think about what's going on today with the Palestinians. You know, they're not just throwing them out of the land, which the original instructions were to Israel to do, go in and take possession of the land, kill everybody in there that isn't you, that doesn't come into a faith of you. Think about this last century. Same things going on. Israel that was coming back to take over the land, by and large, were all claiming to be secular. There were virtually no religious in that group of Jews that came back to repossess the land. God's indignation rises to fury. Think about it. People get all upset with me when I say about this, but if we think about the last century when Israel was the people coming back to take possession were disclaiming God, God's indignation rose to the point that Hitler was loosed and 6 million died because they were refusing to claim him as their God. Fury. Fury. So if we think about these things, maybe we can start to understand the chastening of God of his people. It's going to get brutal. They say 2/3 of Israel is going to perish before Messiah returns. Oh my, oh my, oh my. Let me play with my notes for a minute. As we continue this chapter, it can be construed that Antiochus Epiphanes, in Antiochus Epiphanes, I guess I should state this chapter has been fulfilled, this chapter 8. But one unmistakable fact is that in verse 19, it intentionally goes beyond Antiochus Epiphanes to the foreshadowing of the final Gentile ruler on the earth at the end. Daniel 8:20 through 22, please. You saw a ram with 2 horns, which were the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy male goat is the king of Greece, and the prominent horn between its eyes the first king. As for the horn that broke and the 4 that rose in its place, 4 kings will arise out of this nation, but not with the power of the first king. Wow. We're repeating ourselves again, but for a purpose. Gabriel is now stating this to Daniel. He begins to interpret the vision for Daniel. The ram with the 2 horns is specifically named as Medo-Persia. We've indicated this, but it's now specifically named. This is one of the reasons why Daniel would say at the end he was confused. The Medes and the Persians were out there in Daniel's life, but not yet an empire. And this confused him because he was part of another empire, the Babylonian Empire. And then there's this whole shtick about the Greek Empire coming along that replaces the Medes and the Persians. Daniel's still working for the king of the Babylonian Empire. This vision is going 2 empires ahead of Daniel. The male goat with the 1 prominent horn is a version of the Greek Empire, but so are the 4 horns also versions of the Greek Empire, just a different form. And this is the first. I want you to think about this. This 3rd empire of man, when that first horn became 4 horns and then ultimately a 5th horn came out of it, this 3rd empire was the first of the empires of man that changed its form and still survived. Still survived. Picture of what's coming for us in the 4th empire. The 4th Gentile empire of man was founded by Rome. It has changed itself many times already since its formation, and it's going to change itself again before Messiah return, and it still survives. It's what's out there. The single horn is in general agreement by all scholars to be Alexander the Great. The 4 horns, the divisions of the Greek Empire reformed at his death. So, take all that now to Daniel 8:23. In the latter part of their reign, that's talking about the evildoers that have become as evil as possible, there will arise an arrogant king skilled in intrigue. His power will be great, but not with the power of the first king. He's talking about Antiochus. Talking about an arrogant king, skilled with intrigue. His power great, but not his power as great as the first king, Alexander. He will be amazingly destructive. He will succeed in what he does. He will destroy the mighty and the holy ones. Next. He will succeed through craftiness and deceit, become swelled with pride, destroy many people just when they feel most secure. He will even challenge the prince of princes, but without human intervention he will be broken. The vision of the evenings and the mornings, which has been told, is true, but you are to keep the vision secret because it is about the days. It is about days in the distant future. Remember, Gabriel is tying all of this together, Antiochus and the coming false Messiah. In these verses, attention is directed to one individual, the characteristics that this one individual have, and lists the characteristics. He will appear in the latter times of the four divisions of the Greek Empire. Near the end of this third empire of man, he will appear when the Jewish evildoers become as evil as possible. This really requires some expansion, but time is limited, so let me give it to you just in a quick summary. The Gentile pagans are basically already evil in God's eyes, as the Syrian Empire is coming under Antiochus and he's expanding. But the Jews, God's people, are moving towards that degree of evil, the idolatry and so forth that the Gentiles that are imposing themselves on them are bringing. And when they reach this, achieve the level of evil of the Gentiles, then God is going to bring this person to rule over them. And that isn't any depth of explanation, but it gets us the idea here of what's going on. The characteristics of Antiochus, which we can apply to the coming false messiahs: he will be an arrogant king, skilled in intrigue. He will be great and very destructive. Not as great as Alexander. It's pretty obvious that this is Antiochus, gains his power from somewhere not normal. That will be the same with the false Messiah. Some believe that that power will come from Hasatan, from the adversary. Some even think that Alexander was the one that supplied Antiochus through some retrofit after Alexander died, and Satan using the spirit of Alexander to influence this. Bottom line is that it's not from God. Even though it comes through Hasatan, God controls it and limits it. So ultimately, it's God that does control it. Did I make that clear? About the future, we know from Revelation 13:1 that the beast, the false Messiah, derives his power directly from Satan. We know that. But only because God allows it. Only because God allows it. And this king, the beast, the false Messiah, will accomplish great exploits, including much destruction of Israel, just like Antiochus. He's going to destroy a lot of the mighty and the holy ones because he's going to suck them in. He's going to cause them to change what they believe because he's going to be so slick and so smooth. He will succeed through craftiness and deceit. We know who the author of this is. He'll be always hatching plots. His success will fill him with great pride. He will exalt himself. He will do these things, his coming to power, by means of a false peace. He will destroy many people just when they feel secure. And these many people is speaking of Israel's population, who Satan, since Israel's creation, has been determined to destroy throughout Scripture. He will even challenge the Prince of Princes, generally defined as the Holy One of Israel, but in the end he will be broken without human intervention. His destruction will come from God. Now let's touch again for 1 minute on the evildoers becoming as evil as possible. This is speaking of the Jews inhabiting Judah and Jerusalem, basically when they reach the fullness of their rebellion against God. God brings the little horn against them. This occurs when both Jews and Gentiles are carrying a pagan culture into Jerusalem. Historically, they're going to end up giving themselves over to pleasure. You know, back in the days of Antiochus, they gave themselves over to pleasure, to what the Greeks wanted them to have. They questioned absolute morals. They undermined belief in a supernatural, undermined belief in God. The young and rich of that time had become irritated by the restraints of Torah. We're seeing that today. They mocked the priests of God and the old pious men that worshipped him. They murdered the high priest in Antiochus' day. When Antiochus Epiphanes appeared on the scene, some of the Jewish leaders made agreements with the Greeks. They made strange agreements. They built a pagan gymnasium in Jerusalem for the Greek games. It says in detail things that they did. They played the Greek games totally in the nude. Some of them had their foreskins replaced surgically so they would appear to be good Greeks, not circumcised Jews. They abandoned God's covenants. They instead recorded themselves as Greeks, embraced Greek customs, worshipped Greek gods. Antiochus was bold and crafty, and he took the throne of Syria that did not belong to him by bribery and crafty measures. The vision says the little horn would possess great power, but not of himself. See, Antiochus is the picture. Some think that Hasatan himself empowered Antiochus supernaturally because he wanted to annihilate Jews. Even though there were treaties in place and the Jewish rebels were playing in their gymnasium like good Greeks, Antiochus, even though there were treaties in place, attacked Jerusalem and plundered it. False Messiah is going to bring a treaty of peace for Israel, and then he's going to come in and take over, attack it, plunder it. Antiochus attacked Jerusalem and plundered it, burned major portions of it, tore down buildings, sections of walls, slaughtered many of its inhabitants. The little horn, it said in Daniel's vision, would prosper. Antiochus was very successful, both militarily and in the persecution of Jews. He could do as he pleased. The vision says that the little horn would cause deceit to succeed. Antiochus was known for using deceit in very cunning ways to achieve his goals. There are stories of how he disguised himself as a common man and circulated among the people to find out what they were saying about him. Gabriel even stated that the little horn would stand against the Prince of Princes. That is the Most High God, pointing to the end. Antiochus did just that. He plundered and defiled the temple, then rededicated the temple as a place of worship for Zeus, the chief Greek god, erected a statue of Zeus in the temple, some say with his own face on it, the abomination that causes desolation. Built a pagan altar over the altar of God, offered sacrifices on it of unclean animals, swine. Antiochus had coins minted. He had coins minted. And that inscription on the coin read Antiochus Theos Epiphanes, which means Antiochus the God made manifest. It's a picture for us of the coming false Messiah. Finally, in verse 25, Gabriel states that this king in this vision would be broken without human intervention. No human being would put him to death. Historical records have Antiochus dying in 164 BC of a mysterious disease. They vary on what this was, but all agree that he died without human agency being involved. Nobody killed him. Nobody killed him. So we can see that Gabriel's interpretation can be fully historically realized in Antiochus Epiphanes. However, Daniel chapters 7 through 12 all focus on a great ruler in his kingdom that will arise at the end time. And the thrust is to give us more information about the final form of the Gentile world and its ruler, who is going to conquer the world temporarily. This chapter 8, frankly, is no different than the other chapters. There's no doubt that it speaks to Antiochus Epiphanes, but also it states, verse 19, that it's about the last days of the indignation of God and of the end of times. These passages are difficult. But they go beyond what is historically fulfilled in Antiochus. They foreshadow a world ruler at the end times that would have these same characteristics. Yeshua said in Luke 21:24, the times of the Gentiles was characterized by the treading down of Jerusalem and the subjugation and persecution of the people of Israel. This chapter, I believe, is so important to the understanding of the study we've taken. I'm asking you to please take time to read it again tomorrow. Read clear through it and try to take note of everything we've talked about this evening.